So I want you to imagine it's June 2026.
Okay, yeah, setting the scene.
Right. And the White House reflecting pool has just been completely drained. I mean, they've resurfaced it, and they've painted it this very specific custom color that's officially designated as, like, American flag blue.
Which is quite the aesthetic choice.
It really is. And at the exact same time, contractors are putting the finishing touches on this massive multi-million-dollar expansion of the White House ballroom.
Right.
And here's where the reality check hits. While all these lavish, highly produced domestic projects are wrapping up, 18 renegade politicians are pulling out a procedural nuclear weapon to force $8 billion in war debt onto a really desperate Ukraine.
Yeah, the contrast is just jarring.
Totally. And not only that, but there's a major war in Iran that's driving emergency wartime coal investments here at home. Plus, the entire global diplomatic order is just quietly fracturing in the background.
It's a staggering juxtaposition, honestly. You look at the global landscape right now and the traditional mechanisms of statecraft. They're basically buckling under the weight of sheer domestic distraction.
Yeah.
I mean, the old established baselines of how alliances hold together, or how foreign aid is distributed, or even how nuclear-armed adversaries negotiate with each other, it's all shifting simultaneously.
And it's shifting because the anchor of that system, meaning the United States, is just entirely occupied with overlapping crises, both internal and external.
Exactly.
And so that brings us to our mission for you today. We have this fascinating dispatch of recent BBC News reports, and they detail this sudden, highly volatile political event, which is a 226 to 195 vote in the U.S. House of Representatives.
A vote that has absolutely set off alarm bells in Kiev and Moscow and, well, pretty much every capital across Europe.
Right. So we are going to unpack the mechanics of this Saudi Republican split on Ukraine aid. And we'll examine how a deeply distracted United States is essentially forcing a massive shift in international diplomacy.
And we'll break down what that actually means for the physical front lines of the Russia-Ukraine war, because the on-the-ground impact is huge.
It really is. But before we jump in, just a crucial note for you, the listener. We are analyzing some highly politically charged events today. I mean, we're talking about the Trump administration, divided governments, ongoing global conflicts.
It's a minefield.
It is a minefield. So our goal here is strict neutrality. We are just impartially reporting the facts exactly as they're laid out in our source material. We want to understand the geopolitical mechanics and the underlying logic of these events.
Right. We are definitely not endorsing any specific political viewpoint here.
No, not at all. We are just looking at the mechanics of the machine.
And that machine is currently throwing a lot of sparks.
Seriously.
Because to understand the structural movements, we really have to look past all the partisan rhetoric. We have to examine the actual legislative levers being pulled, the macroeconomic realities of war financing, and the military strategies being deployed on the ground.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start with the immediate inciting incident. So, the U.S. House of Representatives just passed the Ukraine Support Act.
Right.
And the final tally was 226 in favor, 195 against. But the real headline here isn't just that the bill passed, it's how it passed.
The mechanism is the story.
Exactly. 18 Republicans broke ranks. They completely defied their own party leadership, joined the Democrats, and they forced this vote using a procedural tool called a discharge petition.
And this is where we really need to look at the plumbing of the legislative branch, because a discharge petition is not, standard operating procedure.
Not at all.
It is essentially a hostile takeover of the legislative floor.
Yeah.
Because normally in the House, the majority party's leadership, so the Speaker and the Rules Committee, they act as absolute gatekeepers.
Right, they control what gets seen.
Exactly. If they do not want a bill to be voted on, they just bury it. It never sees the light of day. So a discharge petition is really the only mechanism available to bypass that leadership entirely.
And you need a lot of support to do that, right?
You do. If you can get an absolute majority, which is 218 signatures, you can literally pry the bill out of committee and force a mandatory floor vote.
I want to frame this because the stakes are just incredibly high for the individuals involved here. It operates almost exactly like a corporate mutiny.
That's a good way to look at it.
Right, because imagine a company where the CEO and the executive board have literally locked the boardroom doors to prevent, the launch of a new product line.
Right.
But a faction of middle managers quietly teams up with a rival firm, they gather enough shareholder proxies, and they force a binding board vote, completely bypassing the CEO, who is essentially just, standing in the hallway watching it happen.
That is the exact mechanism.
Yeah.
But I'd argue in modern politics, the risks of that kind of mutiny are existential for a representative's career.
Oh, for sure.
Because grassroots support today relies so heavily on absolute party loyalty.
Yeah, the primary system is brutal.
Exactly. So when those 18 Republicans broke from a president who has as fiercely loyal a base as Donald Trump does, they instantly invited primary challengers. I mean, they risked their committee assignments, their national party funding.
Everything.
Right. So they made this very calculated decision that establishing a firm legislative position on European security was somehow worth the almost guaranteed domestic political blowback.
But here is where the logic kind of falls apart for me. Because the sources are explicitly clear about the ultimate fate of this Ukraine Support Act.
Yeah.
It requires Senate approval, and then obviously it requires President Trump's signature.
Right.
Given that these 18 Republicans are openly defying the White House to pass this bill is essentially dead on arrival at the Resolute desk. I mean, it's not going anywhere.
It's extremely unlikely to become law.
So if this legislation has basically zero practical chance of becoming law, aren't they just throwing away their careers for like an expensive piece of political theater? I mean, why should the listener even care about a bill that won't become law?
I get that. But because the passage of the bill itself is the weapon here.
Okay, how so?
Well, you are looking at it strictly as a legal text. But in geopolitics, a vote like this functions as a massive, high-decibel signal.
A signal to who?
To everyone. This bipartisan coalition is sending a message directly to our European allies, and more importantly, to the Kremlin.
Ah, okay.
They are demonstrating structurally that the American legislative branch is not a monolith. By forcing this through with that nuclear procedural option, they're proving that there is a hard, unyielding floor of support for Ukraine within the U.S. government.
Oh, I see. So it fundamentally changes the risk calculus for everyone else.
Exactly.
It forces the administration to actively expend political capital to kill the bill in the Senate or to formally veto it, rather than just, quietly letting it die in a desk drawer somewhere.
Precisely. It forces the White House to own the denial of that aid on the global stage. But to really understand why these 18 Republicans felt emboldened to launch this mutiny right now, we have to pull back and look at the broader environment, because this is not an isolated incident over Eastern European policy.
Not at all.
The Dispatch actually highlights this as the latest in a sudden, very acute pattern of rebellion against the administration.
Yeah, the sources give us two other major examples from literally just this week. And the divergence in the subject matter is really striking.
It's all over the place.
It is. So first we have another foreign policy fracture. 4 House Republicans joined Democrats in a successful vote backing a resolution to stop President Trump from taking further military action in an ongoing war in Iran.
And the administration's response to that specific vote is incredibly revealing.
Yeah, they were not happy.
No. They dismissed the Iran resolution as an unconstitutional attempt to restrict presidential power. And that response brings us to this fundamental, centuries-old friction in the American system.
The war powers debate.
Exactly. The tension between Article 1 and Article 2 of the Constitution. The executive branch is claiming inherent authority as commander-in-chief to manage this hot war in Iran,
Right.
while a very fractured Congress is attempting to claw back its constitutional authority over military adventurism.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, though, because the defiance isn't just limited to foreign policy. The second example the sources give is entirely domestic.
Right, the immigration bill.
Yeah, Republicans basically threatened to derail a critical immigration bill specifically to force the Trump administration to drop what was called an anti-weaponization fund.
Which is fascinating.
It is, because the reporting indicates this fund would have directed public money straight to Trump supporters. And the craziest part is the legislative extortion actually worked. The administration caved and they dropped the plan.
And the mechanics of that anti-weaponization fund pushback, I mean, that shows how deep this fracturing really goes.
Because it's about the money.
Exactly. Congress controls the power of the purse. By threatening a critical piece of the administration's domestic agenda, this immigration bill, these Republicans basically utilized appropriations leverage to kill a discretionary executive fund.
They held it hostage.
They did. It shows that the breakdown in party discipline is bleeding straight from international battlefields right into core domestic legislative priorities.
But let me challenge the premise here for a second, because we have three totally different rebellions happening.
Okay.
We have 18 Republicans overriding leadership to send military aid to Ukraine. We have 4 Republicans trying to constrain presidential war powers in Iran. And then we have this unspecified group using an immigration bill to block domestic public funding.
Right. 3 distinct events.
The motivations are literally all over the map. One is about arming an ally, one is about stopping a Middle Eastern war, and one is about domestic fiscal propriety. If I'm looking at this data, I don't see a cohesive ideological split. I just see a chaotic free-for-all, where individual factions are pursuing completely isolated grievances. Is there actually a unifying thread here?
That's a great question. And the unifying thread is systemic vulnerability.
Vulnerability.
Yes.
Yeah.
You are absolutely right that this is not the birth of some cohesive sub-party with a unified manifesto. What you are witnessing is the symptom of an executive branch fighting battles on way too many simultaneous fronts.
Ah, they're spread too thin.
Exactly. When a leadership structure is actively managing a hot war in Iran, plus complex domestic funding fights, plus severe internal legal battles, its capacity to enforce strict party discipline just collapses.
Because they can't punish everyone at once.
Precisely. These disparate factions, whether they care about the Constitution or Ukraine or domestic spending, they all independently recognize that the administration is overextended. They see a structural weakness, and they are moving aggressively to exploit it.
It makes total sense. If the system is bogged down, the traditional threats of punishment from leadership just lose their teeth.
They really do.
But let's pivot from the political maneuvering in Washington to the actual substance of what caused this specific mutiny in the first place. Let's look at the Ukraine Support Act itself.
The financial structure of it is really important.
It is eye-opening. The bill dictates just over $1 billion, specifically 745 million pounds, in security and reconstruction aid.
Right, direct aid.
But then it also authorizes a massive $8 billion, or 6 billion pounds, in financing loans for defense operations.
And that ratio right there is the absolute key to understanding modern war economics.
The loans versus the grants.
Exactly. Because when the public hears the phrase foreign aid, the assumption is usually that we're talking about grants. Direct transfers of capital or material with absolutely no expectation of financial return.
Right, like charity, essentially.
Yeah. And the $1 billion falls into that category. It is immediate, non-recoverable relief. But authorizing $8 billion in loans fundamentally changes the relationship.
Because they have to pay it back.
This is sovereign war debt.
It feels like watching a tech startup burning through venture capital, but the stakes are literally national survival.
That's a very bleak but accurate analogy.
I mean, Ukraine isn't just fighting an invader. To sustain the fight, they are taking out an $8 billion mortgage on their own sovereign future. How does a nation actively having its infrastructure pulverized pay back an $8 billion loan?
Well, in the immediate term, they don't. They can't.
Obviously.
But the authorization of loans rather than grants serves a very specific political purpose in Washington.
To make it easier to sell to voters.
Exactly. It allows legislators to argue that they are protecting the American taxpayer's long-term balance sheet while still providing immediate massive liquidity to Kyiv.
But the cost to Ukraine is massive.
Long-term, yes. It means their post-war future is instantly collateralized. I mean, if they survive as a sovereign state, they will emerge bound by these incredibly complex debt restructuring agreements, which are likely going to be managed by international financial institutions.
Like the IMF or the World Bank?
Right, and that gives the lending nations immense leverage over Ukraine's eventual economic recovery and their domestic policies for decades.
But right now, in June 2026, they desperately need that liquidity because the tactical reality on the ground is highly complex and it is incredibly expensive.
Very much so.
The BBC Dispatch actually outlines exactly what this $8 billion in defense financing is meant to sustain. We are seeing a war that has evolved far past static trenches.
Oh, absolutely.
Ukraine is actively striking deep into Russian-held territory. The sources highlight a specific drone attack launched by Kyiv on the outskirts of St. Petersburg.
And the rhetoric around that was fascinating.
Yeah, President Zelensky even commented on this specific strike, casually calling it paying a visit.
The phrasing paying a visit is highly calibrated psychological warfare.
It feels very deliberate.
It is. To really understand the mechanics of that St. Petersburg strike, you have to look at the geography and the target itself. St. Petersburg is deep within Russian territory.
Right.
It is Vladimir Putin's hometown. It's a major economic center. Ukraine is not conducting drone strikes there to fundamentally degrade Russia's overall industrial base. They just don't have the sheer volume of munitions required for that.
So what's the mechanism then? If it's not actually destroying the war machine, what does an $8 billion loan buy them by hitting the outskirts of St. Petersburg?
It buys in displacement.
Displacement.
Yes, it is a classic asymmetric tactic. By proving they can penetrate the airspace around one of Russia's most vital cities, especially during a period when, as the sources note, Putin himself was present for an economic forum. Ukraine forces the Russian military command to make a terrible choice.
Oh, I see. They have to defend it.
Exactly. They must pull highly advanced, incredibly expensive air defense systems away from the active front lines in eastern Ukraine and redeploy them deep inside Russia just to protect domestic population centers and political hubs.
Wow, so it thins out the shield over the actual battlefield.
Yes, and on top of the logistical shift, it also totally pierces the narrative of invulnerability that the Kremlin constantly projects to its own citizens.
So it's a psychological strike that forces a massive logistical error. That is fascinating.
It is.
And the sources contrast that deep strike tactic with another operation happening simultaneously in occupied Crimea.
Right. Simferopol.
Yeah, Russian-backed authorities blamed Ukraine for strikes in Simferopol that left 4 dead, and Ukraine publicly confirmed they hit a fuel depot there.
Now, if St. Petersburg is psychological, Simferopol is purely logistical.
Because of the fuel.
Yes. Mechanized warfare is entirely dependent on fuel. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, massive supply convoys, they're all completely useless without diesel.
It's just expensive paperweights.
Exactly. And a fuel depot in occupied Crimea is basically the arterial lifeblood for the Russian forces holding the southern front.
So when Ukraine hits it.
When Ukraine utilizes that defense financing to acquire the satellite intelligence and the precision-guided munitions required to obliterate a specific fuel node in Simferopol, they are systematically starving the Russian front line of operational capacity.
So we basically have the U.S. Congress locked in a procedural civil war over whether to finance this. And while they are fighting over signatures on a discharge petition, Ukraine is out there executing these highly sophisticated existential operations.
Operations that require constant funding.
Right, but because the United States is so consumed by its internal mutinies and its external war in Iran, the geopolitical gravity is shifting. The diplomatic vacuum that's being created by a distracted America is forcing these unprecedented changes on the ground.
A distracted superpower is a highly destabilizing element. I mean, historically, when the primary security guarantor for a region steps back to deal with its own crises, the regional actors do not just pause the war.
They don't just wait around.
No, they alter their strategies entirely, and they often end up taking much greater risks.
Which leads us directly to the most jarring diplomatic development in this entire dispatch. Because recognizing this vacuum, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky published an open letter to Vladimir Putin proposing direct face-to-face talks.
A huge shift.
And the sources quote Zelensky's rationale explicitly. He stated it would be, quote, wrong to simply wait until the war in Europe becomes the focus of U.S. attention again.
We really have to analyze the weight of that phrase, wrong to simply wait.
Yeah, it feels heavy.
It is. For years, the absolute cornerstone of Ukraine's diplomatic strategy has been Western unity. Specifically, relying on American diplomatic and economic leverage to force Russia into a negotiated settlement.
The U.S. was the big stick.
Exactly. So Zelensky's open letter is a stark, very public acknowledgement that this strategy is no longer viable. He is watching the U.S. Congress fight over discharge petitions. He is watching the U.S. military engage in a hot war in Iran, and he is calculating that the American cavalry is simply not coming.
So what does this all mean? If we go back to the idea of a courtroom, it feels like 2 opposing lawyers are in the middle of this vicious trial.
Okay.
And suddenly, the judge just walks out of the room to handle a riot out in the hallway. The bailiff leaves, the jury is completely dismissed, and the lawyers just look at each other across the aisle and realize they have to figure it out themselves.
It is a profound realization.
Yeah.
But the problem is it places Ukraine in an incredibly vulnerable position.
Because they lost the judge.
Right. When you attempt to negotiate a peace settlement with a much larger nuclear-armed adversary, and your primary superpower backer is distracted, literally out of the room, your leverage is fundamentally compromised.
And we see Russia instantly exploit that compromised leverage, because Zelensky didn't just ask for a meeting, he actually called for a full ceasefire during the proposed negotiations.
And Putin's response?
Putin immediately ruled it out. Just flat no.
And Putin's rejection of the ceasefire is the tell here.
What do you mean?
In military negotiations, if an army is exhausted or if they're losing ground, they will eagerly accept a ceasefire during talks. It gives them a chance to rearm, rotate troops, fortify their positions.
I need the breather.
Exactly. By refusing to halt the fighting, Putin is signaling total confidence. He recognizes that the U.S. is bogged down in the Middle East and fighting itself domestically.
Right.
So he is perfectly willing to sit at a table with Zelensky, but he intends to do it while Russian artillery continues to pound Ukrainian positions. He wants to maximize the physical pressure on Kiev during every single minute of that negotiation.
But the sources also note a really long history of failure here. I mean, previous peace talks in Geneva, Abu Dhabi, and Istanbul have all completely collapsed.
Yes, they have.
So why would Zelensky abandon those frameworks now and push for a direct, unmediated meeting with an adversary who absolutely refuses to stop shooting?
Because the mediated talks suffer from the very proxy dynamics that Zelensky is actively trying to escape.
Okay, unpack that.
When you hold talks in places like Geneva or Abu Dhabi or Istanbul, the mediators themselves bring their own geopolitical baggage to the table.
Oh, true.
Right. Switzerland has its strict neutrality protocols. The UAE has incredibly complex energy relationships with both Russia and the West. Turkey controls the Bosphorus Strait and constantly balances its NATO membership with Russian trade.
So everyone has an ulterior motive.
Exactly. In those environments, the negotiations inevitably get bogged down in the broader interests of the host nations and the observing superpowers. By proposing direct talks, Zelensky is essentially gambling that stripping away all that international noise might be the only way to find a brutal but actual resolution.
And the reaction from the United States to this massive shift in diplomacy is almost surreal. I mean, President Trump commented on Zelensky's proposal for direct talks, and the sources quote him saying, who thought, quote, "It would be great if the two leaders met."
It is a stunning abdication of traditional American foreign policy doctrine.
It really is.
I mean, for the last 70 years, the baseline imperative of the U.S. State Department has been to maintain a presence and exert influence over any major security realignment in Europe.
We always want to be at the table.
The U.S. historically demands to be in the room to ensure the outcome aligns with American strategic interests.
Right.
So for the president to casually endorse a direct, totally unmediated negotiation between a key Western ally and Russia, it is the ultimate confirmation of that diplomatic vacuum we talked about.
Yeah.
It signals that Washington is actively choosing to step back from its role as the primary architect of the global security order.
And to really grasp why Washington is stepping back, we have to look at the incredibly bizarre, almost schizophrenic, broader picture of the American domestic landscape that's provided in this dispatch.
It is a lot to take in.
It is. When you synthesize the other headlines from June 2026, it paints a picture of a government experiencing severe cognitive dissonance.
Well, the domestic environment always dictates the limits of foreign policy, always. And the domestic environment detailed in these sources is fractured across multiple, highly contradictory realities.
Let's lay out these contradictions because the mechanics are just fascinating.
Okay.
First, you have a country actively managing the economic fallout of a hot war. The ongoing conflict in Iran is actively driving up energy costs for American consumers.
Right.
In response, the sources note that Trump has utilized wartime powers to direct a $700 million investment into the coal industry.
And we need to unpack the mechanism of that coal investment because it illustrates just how deeply this foreign conflict is impacting the domestic economy.
How does that work?
When a war in the Middle East disrupts global energy supply chains, domestic gas and oil prices naturally spike. By invoking wartime executive powers, likely using mechanisms akin to the Defense Production Act, the administration is forcibly injecting federal capital directly into the coal sector.
So they're subsidizing it.
Yes. The goal is to rapidly subsidize the extraction and distribution of domestic energy to artificially suppress those consumer prices.
Wow.
It is a drastic economic maneuver that links the daily utility bills of American voters directly to the battlefield in Iran.
So you have these wartime economic interventions, a legislative mutiny over billions in sovereign war debt, and a geopolitical crisis in Europe.
Right.
That is reality one. But reality two, happening on the exact same day, involves immense executive focus and capital being spent on things that feel utterly disconnected from global stability.
The aesthetic projects.
Exactly. The sources detail that after a weeks-long renovation, the White House reflecting pool has been painted a specific American flag blue.
And the aesthetic focus extends way beyond just the pool.
Yeah.
The dispatch also highlights this massive structural expansion of the White House ballroom, which has apparently doubled in size and cost over the past year.
Add to that the cancellation of concerts meant to celebrate America's 250th birthday, and a major high-level legal crisis happening concurrently. John Bolton, a former Trump advisor turned critic, has reached a deal with prosecutors and is expected to plead guilty in a classified documents case.
Which is a huge distraction internally.
It's massive. If you are the listener trying to synthesize a coherent picture of American statecraft, how do you even reconcile this? How does a government simultaneously invoke emergency wartime powers for coal, fight a brutal internal war over foreign aid, manage a classified documents plea deal from a former top official, and literally obsess over painting a reflecting pool American flag blue?
You reconcile it by recognizing it as a hallmark of an overstretched system.
Overstretched.
Yes. And to an adversary, whether it is Putin calculating his leverage in Ukraine or leadership in Beijing or Tehran, this cognitive dissonance is highly actionable intelligence.
Oh, they're watching this closely.
Absolutely. When they look at Washington, they do not see a laser-focused superpower executing a grand strategy. They see a government whose attention is dangerously fragmented.
It's basically the image of an empire agonizing over the color of the grapes, while the structural columns of the house are actively splintering.
Exactly. Adversaries calculate their risk based on the coherence of the American response.
Right.
If the U.S. executive branch is burning political capital on massive ballroom expansions, while battling its own party over discharge petitions and managing the fallout of high-profile legal pleas, the perceived risk of defying the U.S. on the global stage just plummets.
Because we're too busy to do anything about it.
Exactly. This fragmentation is precisely why Putin feels zero pressure to agree to a ceasefire. It is precisely why Zelensky feels he has absolutely no choice but to negotiate alone. The surreal, chaotic nature of the American domestic landscape isn't just a political sideshow, it is the primary engine driving international instability right now.
It is a staggering chain reaction. I mean, we started by looking at a single legislative vote, 226 to 195.
A relatively small procedural thing.
Right. But when you pull back, you see how 18 Republicans, using a procedural tool to force $8 billion in war debt, actually illuminates a massive structural breakdown.
It's the thread that unravels the sweater.
Exactly. You see an America heavily burdened by an Iran war invoking emergency economic powers, yet simultaneously consumed by aesthetic renovations and internal legal battles. And that specific domestic distraction is creating a massive diplomatic vacuum, forcing allied nations like Ukraine to abandon Western mediation entirely and face their adversaries alone.
It demonstrates that the mechanics of global security are fundamentally tied to the internal discipline of the United States. And when that discipline fails, the world order shifts.
Which leaves us with a massive, lingering question for you to mull over as these events continue to unfold. We've spent this time analyzing how America's domestic political gridlock and these surreal external distractions are forcing regional powers to bypass Washington entirely.
A development that, frankly, rewrites the rules of engagement for the 21st century.
Right. So the question is, are we witnessing the dawn of a post-American global era?
That's the big one.
If American political dysfunction ironically accelerates the creation of a world order that no longer waits for the United States to mediate its conflicts, a world where nations secure their own sovereign debt and negotiate their own ceasefires in a total vacuum, what happens to global stability when the distracted judge simply never returns to the courtroom?
That is the exact structural fracture that every intelligence agency on Earth is currently trying to measure.
And it is one we will absolutely keep analyzing. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of a shifting world. Keep questioning the consensus, and we will catch you next time.